Cognitive decline is one of the most feared aspects of aging. We often notice the signs too late: forgetfulness, confusion, or difficulty concentrating, when much of the damage has already been done. But what if we could detect changes in the brain years earlier and protect memory and cognition before decline sets in? Welcome to the Aging Well podcast, where we explore the science, stories, and strategies behind living a longer, healthier, and more purposeful life. I am your host, Dr. Jeff Armstrong, an exercise physiologist with a passion for making science simple and life better as we age. My guest is Dr. Adrian Owen, a world-renowned neuroscientist and author of the best-selling book, Into the Gray Zone. His groundbreaking research has refined our understanding of consciousness, memory, and cognitive decline, and he is at the forefront of efforts to make brain health something we can track and protect throughout life. This conversation will explore the science of the aging brain, the future of cognitive health, and practical steps to help us all age well. The Aging Well podcast encourages informed decision-making and always consult your physician and scientific literature when making decisions about your health. Professor Owen, welcome to the Aging Well podcast. You've dedicated much of your career to studying the brain and consciousness. What sparked your interest in the science of cognitive decline and aging?
Oh, that goes back about 35 years. I mean, I did my PhD in the UK in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And what really intrigued me was, how can we understand what's going wrong in the brains of patients who don't have specific brain damage? So things like dementia and Parkinson's disease and other neurodegenerative conditions, there's not a bit of the brain that you can look at and say, oh, that's damaged, that's why they have a problem. So, yeah, the big picture that really got me interested was, well, how could you understand what the basis of the impairments that the challenges that these patients face? How could you understand that? And of course, that era was the beginning of brain imaging, and I've always been a very sort of techie person. So as soon as brain imaging, PET, positron emission tomography, fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging came along, I was in there, and that's what I've been doing ever since.
So for many people, memory loss is just a normal part of aging. I mean, we talk about that a lot on this podcast, that people just expect that I'm getting older, or you go to your doctor and you say, well, I'm starting to forget where my keys are. Oh, well, it's just part of aging. How much of that is true, and how much of it is really preventable?
Well, that's a complex question, but let's unpack it bit by bit. So, I mean, the problem is, of course, that we all face challenges with not only memory, but attention, concentration, planning ahead, problem solving. All of these cognitive faculties tend to get a little bit. They tend to deteriorate a little bit with normal aging, and the real challenge is trying to work out whether that in any one individual that is just, those are just the signs of regular aging, sort of wear and tear on the brain, if you like, or whether the person is actually dementing. And I mean, this is something we've worked on a lot, and there's two important points here. The first is that dementia is rather progressive rather rapidly. So actually, it's not as hard as you might think to tell the difference between somebody who is dementing and somebody who's aging not in a typical way. But you do have to wait. And typically, in the case of dementia, you would see a change over even 3 to 6 months. Whereas for most of us who are who do not have a dementing illness, you wouldn't expect things to change that rapidly. So the speed of change, is really important. The other thing I think that distinguishes normal aging from or typical aging, I should say, probably from a dementing illness, is the range of things that can go wrong. And people often associate dementia with forgetfulness, but actually it's much bigger than that. Patients actually present, the earliest signs really are with attentional ability to concentrate, to focus on things. Memory I think, gets a lot of attention because it's the thing that people most easily identify. If they forget things, they know what's going on. But people are not as aware of the fact that they're losing the ability to attend or to concentrate. So again, there are differences in when somebody's dementing and when somebody's aging, typically in the range of different cognitive faculties that become that start to deteriorate, if you like, and we can use that to determine the difference between the two situations.
Okay. Seems like when you're talking about, normal aging being kind of the initial signs of dementia being kind of a loss of focus, it just gets me thinking about how much we just naturally, because of our behaviors, are losing focus because, we're scrolling on our phones and those types of things. How much does that play a role in kind of the difficulty in identifying whether it is dementia or whether it's just kind of a normal brain function?
Well, here you need to take other factors into consideration, of course, like age. And of course, yes, certainly people are more distracted these days. There's a lot more to distract us, and people are using their phones more and these things. You're absolutely right. But of course, that's not something that is unique to people who are aging. That's something that happens across, perhaps even more so in young people. So really the answer to your question is that you need to look at very large numbers of people at different age groups to establish what is, quotes, normal and what is what is pathological deterioration, if you like. And really you can factor out, if you have large numbers of people, you can factor out things like how distracting the environment is, based on what you see in different age groups. Now, obviously, you don't expect people under the age of 40 to be dementing, but they might well be distracted by their phones. And you can use that as a sort of a baseline to work out whether old people are showing abnormal levels of lack of focus or not.
So that kind of brings me to the next question, because, again, if we're starting to see people normally losing focus because of the behavior of society, but we also hear of a lot of people having dementia, early onset dementia and those types of things. So why is early detection of dementia and cognitive decline so difficult? Is it because some of those other factors contributing?
It is, yeah. I mean, there's really two reasons. One is that the onset of dementia is, despite what I said about needing to look over 3 or 6 months, it's relatively slow. It is something that doesn't happen one day. You don't wake up and you're suddenly demented. So, and because of that, it's difficult to determine when somebody presents with, for example, attentional problems or memory problems. It is difficult on that one occasion to determine whether they are on the road to dementia or whether they are just suffering the sort of normal challenges of typical aging. That's sort of what we really specialize in trying to do. And we've been developing a number of cognitive tools that actually do quite well tell the difference. The way they do that is by using a simple form of artificial intelligence known as machine learning. We've looked at very, very large numbers of patients that turn up at neurology clinics, followed them, looked at those who go on to develop. These are people that turn up and say, "Hey, I think I might be dementing because I'm getting forgetful," or a spouse will say, I'm not quite sure that he's quite as sharp as he used to be. And then we look at the outcome in those patients, and we look at the differences retrospectively. What were the differences in their pattern of impairments or their pattern of performance on cognitive tests when they first presented, and can we use that to predict whether this person is just aging typically or is likely on the road to dementia? And we're doing pretty well at it, actually. It has taken an awful lot of work and many thousands of participants, many people giving us their time and their data. But actually, we're getting better and better at it.
Now, when I go to I'm 62. When I go to my doctor never does anything to kind of screen me for dementia or any of those types of things. And it may just be because I present myself sharp enough. But I do, I have my memory issues and things like that where I might forget a name or something. And I know a lot of that is just normal part of aging and a cluttered, unfocused brain. But how do you envision regular cognitive screening becoming as routine as somebody going in, having their blood pressure checked, cholesterol checked?
I think we have to do this. Fortunately, the world is moving in that direction. Many people use devices to measure their heart rate or the amount of exercise they're doing or their steps, whatever. And I think we do have to do the same thing for the brain. And I think if you look historically, the problem was always the same. I mean, nobody ever, I don't know, 10, 20 years ago really cared about monitoring their heart rate. Yet I suspect about half the world does it now with, smartwatches and these sorts of things. People have sort of woken up to the fact that prevention is really important. You don't wait until you have a heart attack. You simply, using monitoring your cardiac fitness can help you detect in advance there might be problems. And I think we have to do exactly the same thing with the brain, which is that the reasons are, going back to what you just said about going to your doctor. And I think one of the reasons why your doctor, I think the comment you made is maybe I present as being sharp or whatever. Well, this is the problem, is that people can compensate really quite well for quite a long time. So, when you turn up at your doctor's and you're 62 and you may well be on the road to dementia, if you're in the early stages, most people, it doesn't look obvious even to a professional that there's actually a problem. I give you an example. I had a conversation very recently with a patient who, well, I shouldn't say a patient, she's a person who was concerned, whose husband was concerned that she was dementing. And I was really surprised. We had a Zoom conversation and it was a perfectly normal conversation. Yet when we gave her our cognitive tests, which are sensitive to detecting the early signs of deterioration, she was all over the place. There was no question at all that her cognitive faculties were impaired, especially given that she'd had a high-flying career up until that point. So she was certainly had been a very high-functioning person. But honestly, even as a person who's interviewed hundreds and hundreds of demented patients over the years, she presented like a perfectly normal, she was actually about your age, mid-60s person. So yeah, this is the problem, that people can compensate really well for quite a long time. And this is why it's important to use objective tests, to not sit down, just have a conversation and try and work out whether the person is impaired, or not to say, are you having problems with forgetfulness, but actually to test them routinely and longitudinally, test them now, and then, maybe even if it's only once a year, it means that we can sort of keep tabs on, or get in early with those people who, are likely on the road to dementia.
And what are some of those early warning signs that people should pay attention to long before a diagnosis?
So I would say, if you're just struggling to do things that you used to do very easily, I think that's a really important sign. And this is obviously not formal. What I would say is you should formally have routine cognitive testing, perhaps once a year. But if you're just interested in, is there any chance that I'm that I should I really be getting in line for cognitive testing? I would say, once you start to realize that you can't do some of the things that you used to do, maybe you're having problems planning a family vacation, it just all gets too much for you to put all the pieces together, or these sorts of things. The problem with that is that by then it's a little bit too late. So again, I go back to saying that I think once you get into your 60s, I would say, regardless of whether you think you have a problem or not, you will detect it much more quickly using objective cognitive tests.
Do you think 60 is the age to start, or do you think that maybe earlier ages might be even better because we get that long baseline of that person's kind of normal cognitive function? Because I know people that were, when they were in their teens and 20s, they're a little bit scatterbrained, couldn't plan, events or those types of things. And so it was just normal for them. And so normal is normal.
That's a really great comment. So I would say that ideally, and I think if we can really get people hooked on this idea, this will happen in the same way that it's happened with, the steps that we walk and our cardiac fitness and things. If we can get people into the habit of having a cognitive checkup, say once a year, I think people should start as early as they possibly can. And the reason for that is not because I think people are dementing, in their 20s and 30s. It's because one, the reason you just said that, it's good to have a real baseline. And some people aren't as sharp as other people when they're in their 20s and 30s. And when you get into your 60s and 70s, it can look like to somebody that didn't know you beforehand, it can look like maybe, you're not, you've deteriorated when in fact, maybe you weren't operating at that level at all. That's the first thing. The second thing is, of course, there's many more things that can go wrong with your brain during a lifetime than dementia. Concussion is another thing that we do a lot of work on. And of course, many people suffer a concussion at some point during their lifetime. The problem with concussion, typically that we find, is, how do you know what are the effects of the concussion if you didn't do any pre-testing? And this is a real problem. People come along and they say, I'm really sure that, my memory's shot. And you really can't tell unless you had a set of tests beforehand. So again, that gets solved if perhaps once a year people have a sort of cognitive workup, if you like. And this is not a terribly arduous thing. I mean, one of the things that's changed over the last few years is, of course, digital cognitive testing. And, we've developed a tool at Creyos that does exactly this. And it takes about 30 minutes and you get a very thorough cognitive evaluation. So this doesn't require that you get in a line to go and see a trained neuropsychologist and sit down for 3 hours and do a bunch of boring tests. These are things that can be taken online. They can be done very efficiently, very quickly, and very cheaply. So, I'm all for getting people to do this, starting early and doing it free.
If you're enjoying the Aging Well podcast, be sure to like, subscribe, or follow on your favorite platform so you will never miss an episode. And if you find our conversations helpful, please share the podcast with a friend, because aging is something we're all doing and we're better at doing it together. And support our guests in this podcast financially by visiting the affiliate links in the episode description below, and use the links or codes provided for discounts on products we have vetted and feel comfortable recommending to our valued viewers and listeners. Thank you. And now back to the podcast. So do you envision any apps or things like that might go on our smartphones in the future where, we're just, because we Thrive 25 is an app that, we've kind of become an affiliate for, and allows you to enter a lot of information that could collect all of the data from, different doctor's appointments and tell you when you have appointments and don't have appointments. And I can almost envision kind of an app where, we love playing our little phone games when we're bored, and, you play something that every time you play it gives you a little bit of data that could be used to kind of track how your brain is functioning. Do you envision anything like that in the future?
Right. So, that's exactly what we developed. This is something that started again back in my PhD days in the late 1980s. Obviously, this was pre-internet times, but I was working on a very early touchscreen system. It didn't work like the sort of tablets and phones that we have today. It was a sort of infrared, an old clunky iron infrared thing, but it worked. And we had patients and healthy participants performing cognitive tests on a computer in those days. And then, of course, we went to laptops, and around about the sort of turn of the century, we moved into putting it on the internet. And most recently, we made it available on phones. Now, so this is Creyos.com. And the interesting thing about it is that it's absolutely designed to follow you longitudinally. So if you and all of the tests are presented like games, as you've just described. So they're fun to do. They take between 1.5 and 3 minutes. But the difference or the important thing is they're really grounded in the research that's come out of my lab over the last 30 years. So these aren't just they're not just games. Behind the gamified look, if you like, are things that dive really deeply into your brain function, and they're really tied to different aspects of brain function, different structures in your brain, different networks within your brain, and that we've established through more than 500 scientific publications that have used things like brain imaging or patients with specific types of impairments to try and understand the relationship between these tests and brain function. So they're very sensitive, and they're really good at detecting when something is going, and I guess more importantly, what is going wrong, because it's typically it'll be one thing or one of several things that are impaired. Now, One of the important things that we worked out early on is that people are going to need to test themselves on different occasions. And that's not just to detect dementia. It's also because, for example, if you have a concussion and you want to check whether you're as good as you used to be. But also people are very interested in things like, the effects of exercise or the effects of caffeine. And as I say, we have these enormous number of scientific publications. Probably about a tenth of them are from my lab. Many have come from other labs around the world, looking at things like how different types of drugs affect performance on the test, how different lifestyle habits, drinking, smoking, exercise, stress, sleep, COVID. We had a COVID study. We've looked at all of these things and how they affect performance on the test. And the important thing in all of those cases is not what is the situation right now? It's what's the difference between these two sets of tests. Here it is when I'm sleep deprived versus this is when I'm not sleep. This is when I've got long COVID. This is what I had before I had long COVID. The real secret to being able to analyze and understand an individual's cognitive function is to be able to assess them on multiple occasions. So sorry, very long-winded answer, but you really hit the nail on the head, which is that you need to be able to follow yourself across time. So the tool is developed exactly like that you take the test and then it stores your data for that occasion. And if you do them again a month later, when perhaps you haven't had a good night's sleep, you want to know how you're doing, you do the test again, and you see both sets of scores. Also, what the software does is an automatic analysis on whether there is any so-called meaningful change. I don't want to bore people with statistics here, but it's very difficult to do statistics on a single person. You test yourself once, you test yourself again. Doing real statistics are quite hard. But there is a measure known as meaningful change, which does allow you to look at the difference between two occasions in a single individual. But to do that, you have to be able to reference tens of thousands of other people. So because we have more than 14 million tests have been taken so far, we have all that data. So we know what a typical person looks like being tested today and then 1 month or today, 1 year from today. And you can use those millions of data points to generate a good reference. This is what a normal person will look like tested across across that time frame. And that's how you can look at an individual and say, so this person has changed abnormally, if you like. It's a meaningful change. And that's really important. One more point, if I can make it. Sorry, I know I'm talking a lot, but the interesting thing about cognition is that people, I think, often don't appreciate is that cognition is not like height. It's not like a static, or at least once you become an adult. It's not like a static value that is exactly the same every single day. Cognition is more like blood pressure, in the sense that you've got an approximate blood pressure, but on any given day, your performance or your blood pressure will move around that. It'll go up a bit or down a bit, and it may be because you had too much coffee one day, or you've just come in from a workout, and so blood pressure can change from day to day, but it changes around an average. And cognition is exactly the same. And that's why meaningful change is really important, because, if I test your memory for digits, numbers today, and I test it again in a week's time, there might be a small difference, but that may just be day-to-day variations based on, the choices you've made that day, the things you've done that day. And I need to be able to say, oh, this is actually a meaningful change, meaning that this is not just within the natural variation that you expect from day to day. And again, we've been able to develop tools to do that by looking at tens of thousands of individuals tested on multiple occasions to work out, what is the norm? What are the normal levels of fluctuations from day to day? And what is outside that norm? There you go.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a data geek. So I hope more and more of our listeners and viewers are getting that way. I mean, you can get, like you said, there's so many different trackers, and the more data that we can collect about ourselves, the more we can begin to evaluate some of these lifestyle decisions that we are making about aging well. And, you buy a supplement. What is it really doing? If you have there's so many supplements that claim to, be good for your brain and everything else. But, if you're tracking your data and you're not seeing any change, are you really spending your money wisely when it comes to that? So what does,
that's great,
go ahead.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, I've been involved in a number of studies like that where, people swear by certain interventions. They'll say, well, I find that doing this or doing that or taking this supplement. And we often get drawn into actually scientifically testing those things. And the platform that's Creyos that's come out of my lab is perfect for doing that because, and I would say 9 times out of 10, we end up debunking the intervention, whatever it is, because of course people often read a lot into the hype, and very often the science is very different.
So what does neuroscience tell us about the connection between sleep, memory, and cognitive decline? Because we talk about sleep a lot on this podcast.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's great. We did a study of 17,000 people. I think it was in 2018. It came out on sleep. It was in collaboration with a media organization. So we managed to generate a lot of interest in this. And basically the question we asked people is, do you think sleep is affecting your cognitive function? So we ended up recruiting 17,000 people. We got them to tell us how much sleep they'd had the night before they took our tests at Creyos, but also what their sleeping habits were, how much sleep they normally get. Was last night typical or was last night atypical, and so on. There's some really interesting things came out of it. Let me sort of talk you through them. First of all, this one isn't terribly surprising. The perfect amount of sleep for maintaining your cognitive function was between 7 and 8 hours a night. So I think it was about 7.6 hours of sleep a night is the best thing you can do to optimize your cognitive function the next day. The second point is that more than half of our sample weren't getting that amount of sleep. So most people, if you like, aren't actually getting enough sleep these days. And I think that's, really important finding. The other one is that too much sleep is as bad for you as too little sleep. So we had some people that claimed to sleep 12 or 13 hours a night. And in those cases, their cognitive performance was more like people sleep 4 or 5 hours a night than it was people that got the optimal 7 to 8. So, there's a thing. Too much sleep is as bad for you as too little sleep. Another interesting finding was that, many people claimed to, slept maybe 4 hours the night before. And actually, in terms of, if you want to talk in terms of IQ, we can sort of approximately talk about IQ or age. It knocked about, actually, age is probably better. It made them cognitively like somebody almost 10 years older than themselves. So if you're 50, and you only get 4 to 5 hours sleep last night, and you do the cognitive test, you will appear to perform like a 60-year-old. So it adds about 10 years to your age. That's the bad news. The good news is you can get back to where you were with just one good night's sleep. So we had people sleep on multiple occasions and report how much sleep they got. And it turns out that, it's getting too little sleep is really bad for you the next day. But this is not a permanent thing. This is something that you can fix with one good night's sleep. You can bounce right back to where you were. One more thing that came from it, which I think will be interesting to listeners of this podcast, aging. So many people think, as you get older, you sleep less. So it turned out that was true. I mean, we had people in our study that went from, I think, 18 to 95. So we were able to look at the effects of aging. And sure enough, as people get older, they definitely get fewer hours sleep every night. But what was interesting is the sleep they should get to maintain their cognitive performance didn't change. So actually, it's not what people commonly believe, that is, you need less sleep as you get older. It's that you're getting less sleep as you get older, but really you need just the same amount. And that, I think, is, given what we know about the relationship between sleep and cognition, I think is perhaps an important clue about the relationship between sleep and aging. Maybe if people took steps to maintain their 7 to 8 hours, late into their 70s or 80s, they would have a better chance of maintaining their cognitive function.
Yeah, I like that idea, like the sleep hygiene and the sleep regularity. I try very, very hard to get to bed the same time and get up early, and I'm about the same sleep schedule every day. And I think that regularity is hugely important. But what about other factors like physical activity, nutrition, social engagement? How do those influence brain health as we age?
So I think here, things get a little bit nuanced, actually. And this is where it's important to understand that cognition isn't just one thing. It's not just, it's very similar to physical health, I think. When you think about physical health, there's not one number that describes how physically healthy you are. You could be a really fast runner, or you could be a long distance runner, or you could be great at throwing javelins. All those are different ways of describing that somebody is physically fit, but they don't necessarily overlap. Marathon runners probably don't generally throw the javelin a long way. And I think cognition is really similar to that. There are many different cognitive faculties. They do interact in the same way that aspects of physical fitness interact. But broadly speaking, you can have a really sharp memory, but you may have not be very good at finding your way around the place. We've all heard the sort of stories of absent-minded professors, right? And the reason I say this is because the reason I say it's important to understand that is because these different sort of aspects of or lifestyle choices affect different aspects of cognition. So we've just finished a study of physical exercise, looking at how much physical exercise people typically take in a given week, and how it affects their brain health. And actually what we found is that physical exercise, and this was about 1,000 people, so it wasn't a huge study, it was a pretty large study. We found that physical exercise doesn't affect cognitive function. By that I mean things like memory and concentration and problem solving, but it does affect your mental health. The people that exercise regularly have much better mental health, lower levels of anxiety, lower levels of depression, and of course these are all related to brain function. And so, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't like to claim this was the definitive study. The literature about exercise and brain function is all over the place, to be honest. But this is, by most standards, quite a large study, and we were surprised because many people have claimed that exercise can improve cognition. I mean, one caveat is that I think the evidence that it improves cognition sort of in the immediate term, that is right after you do a run, you may be a little bit sharper. I think the evidence for that is probably a little bit stronger, but then there's pretty good reasons to believe, to understand why that would be the case. Exercise improves blood flow to your brain, and thus those areas of your brain that are required for things like memory and concentration are getting more blood and are better able to function. There's very little evidence, and certainly no evidence from our study, that there are long-term positive effects of exercise on cognitive function, but there are positive effects on mental health, stress, and depression.
So, what was the type of exercise in that particular study?
We looked at we simply looked at, we asked people how much physical exercise they had taken in the previous so there weren't people who were necessarily going to the gym. If somebody was walking every day, that would count as well. But we figured that with 1,000 people, we should be able to find a difference between, essentially we split the group into three. That is, people that take more or less no physical exercise, people that are gym bunnies, and people that are sort of in the middle that maybe walk every day. And it was exactly as you'd expect. The more exercise, the more along that continuum you were towards going to the gym every day, the better your mental health was.
Because I would think it'd be very, very tough. And exercise science, I mean, that's my area, exercise science. The literature is weak in so many ways because there's so much diversity in the nature of exercise and the impact of that particular type of exercise. So even if you lift weights, are you lifting high repetitions? You're doing low repetitions? What particular movements are you doing? Are they movements that are more complex movements? Are you using machines? All that's going to have a different impact on your cognitive abilities. And so I think the real answer there is, keep moving as much as possible, as often as you can, and it's going to have some positive effect, whether it's in the short term or in the long term, of your cognitive abilities. But the more we're using our brain, using our body, using our cardiovascular system synchronistically, I think the better off we're going to ultimately be. Would that be probably a fair assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, you're right. I mean, we had an entire paragraph at the end of our paper saying, we're not saying physical exercise is not good for you. Please go out, get as much exercise as you can, because of course there are enormous benefits of doing physical exercise. Um, but whether or not it's going to have an immediate or long-term effect on, for example, your short-term memories, as you say, is still very, very much unclear. But again, I think it's because most studies historically, and this is why we ended up doing our study, have sort of looked at one type of exercise and one type of cognition. And as you correctly said, physical exercise is multifaceted. There's many, many ways of doing it, and cognition is multifaceted too. So really, it's almost an impossible experiment to do. But you would really want to look at all types of exercise and all types of cognition and try and map one against the other to really get to the answer.
And it gets even more complicated when you look at how different we are individually. I mean, you may respond very different to the same exercises and different parameters. We do the same exercise. You're going to see different cognitive benefits than I'm going to see. You're going to see different physiological benefits. And we just have to understand that overall we see that certain things are good for us, and it may not be as good for you as it is for me, but that doesn't mean it's not good to do. And we're going to see different responses. We have to consider that, what I call the principle of individuality. Everybody's a little bit, which complicates your work and it complicates my work as well. So
it does, and I think on that note, a lot of I think a lot of people feel that they should be able to get better at things that they're actually quite good at to start with. Many people are probably operating at their optimal level. They probably have the best memory they could possibly have. When they're young, I mean, they possibly have. They're focusing or concentrating as well as they possibly could. So I think sometimes people sort of chase this idea that you should be able to get better at everything, but maybe you've maxed out already, and you can certainly decline, of course, which is a different matter, but. A lot of the brain training literature, I think, riffs on this idea that you can get better at things that you might be as good as you could ever be.
Yeah, and I think it's important for us to understand that a lot of aging is just trying to maintain our more youthful function, whether we're talking cognitive, whether we're talking physiological, cardiovascular, muscle health, whatever it might be. It's just trying to optimize your best performance and maintain that. And the same, I would assume, applies for the brain.
It does, and I think that's all we can really expect, to be honest. I think if you can maintain your cognitive function well into old age, then I think you're doing extremely well. And going back to something that we were talking about earlier. I think that's the best you can do, really. I think people shouldn't have too many expectations about improving their cognitive function into older age, because like the rest of your body, your brain suffers wear and tear, and it's inevitable that things won't operate quite as smoothly in your 70s and 80s as they did in your 20s and 30s.
So from your perspective, how important is neuroplasticity in maintaining or even restoring our cognitive function later in life?
I'm probably not going to give you the answer you'd like to hear. I mean, I think neuroplasticity is very important in situations where somebody has undergone, for example, some kind of brain injury. There's no question at all that neurorehabilitation works. People have had strokes and they learn to, move their arm again or whatever it is that wasn't operating after their stroke. There's no question that occurs because of neuroplasticity. Parts of the brain that previously didn't perform a function take over that function, and that can occur even in later years of life. But there's no question that the brain does this much more effectively when you're young than when you're old. A young person recovering from a brain injury is going to do so typically much more quickly than an older person recovering from a brain injury. But that's the case of where you've got a specific injury, whether it's a TBI or a stroke. Or I think in terms of how does what is the role for neuroplasticity in typical aging? I don't think there's very good evidence there's much we can do, to be honest. And that's probably because, you don't have the same situation where a part of your brain that used to perform a function is completely gone. It's just that everything is sort of slowing down a bit. And I think certainly from the brain training literature, it's not at all clear that, or at least from the scientific literature, many people that run commercial brain training companies will argue with me, but I will tell you from scientific literature, there's very little evidence that so-called brain training actually improves your cognitive function at all, beyond the thing you're training on, right? So, if you want to if you want to improve your ability to remember telephone numbers, practicing remembering telephone numbers, you'll get better at it. That's practice. That's learning. The brain's actually quite good at that, even when you're you're in your later years. But by learning or by practicing learning telephone numbers, you're not going to get any better at playing the violin or finding your way around an unfamiliar environment or doing complex math. And this is the big answer from a huge number of brain imaging studies, is that it's very difficult to achieve what is called far transfer. That is something beyond what improvements beyond the thing I'm actually practicing at. I just give you a little bit of good news. That is brain plasticity, right? In the sense that, let's go with the digit idea. If you're trying to remember more telephone numbers, and you practice that, this is not a psychological. Something is changing in your brain to enable you to do that. So in that sense, plasticity is occurring, but it's just not spilling over to sort of make you smarter in any sense. It's just making you good at that thing that you're practicing at. But much the same way as, if you lift a weight, that muscle there is going to get much better, but the muscle over here isn't, if you're doing it with your right hand all the time. It's exactly the same thing.
So it sounds like the principle of specificity that we use in exercise science would apply to cognitive training as well. If you want to specifically improve your ability to remember phone numbers, train yourself at remembering phone numbers, but it's not going to help you do calculus any better.
That's exactly it. And in fact, and the important thing is that the margins are really quite slim. We had a big study of 10,000 people in 2010 that came out in the journal Nature. We had 10,000 people brain trained for 6 weeks on a commercial brain training system. I won't name them for obvious reasons. And we tested them on the Creyos battery at the beginning and at the end, and we found absolutely no difference. The people got really good at the brain training stuff. The thing they were training at, they got really good. 6 weeks practice, you're going to get quite good. But then when we tested them on these objective tests of cognition, there were no changes at all, even though the tests were quite similar to many of the training games. So, it is quite you don't have to depart very far from the thing you're practicing to not see benefits in something else. It doesn't just have to be playing the violin versus doing calculus. Remembering digits, for example, getting people to practice remembering digits didn't make them better at remembering any other type of information. So it doesn't improve your memory in any general sense. It specifically improves your ability to remember numbers. And you ask people to remember shapes or pictures, they're no better, even after 6 weeks of training.
So you've spoken about bridging cutting edge science with everyday healthcare. What does the future of cognitive health look like in terms of prevention and care?
Right. I think I would say prevention and prediction are the two key terms for the future. We're working really hard on prediction. That is, can we identify people, as early as possible who are on the road to dementia? That's a massive question, a massive problem that I think needs to be solved, and I think we and others are doing quite well at getting there. And the reason why it's so important is everybody's heard of these, drugs. There's at least 30 drugs in development now for treating dementia. We're not at the stage of having a drug that can reverse dementia or even prevent dementia, but there are, early signs of some benefits for some people some of the time. But what we do know is that regardless, when those drugs do become available, getting in as early as possible will make them most effective. So that's why it's so important to be able to detect people early on. It's important for, I mean, multiple reasons, not only for the people who are on the road to dementia, but for those people who are just sort of aging typically as well, because you need, if you can be told at the first signs that you think something might be going wrong, this is nothing to worry about, this is just typical aging, this is what you'd expect, then you can plan your life accordingly. You cannot get involved in expensive and complex drug trials for drugs that you don't need and might actually be harmful to you. So it is important to understand, to identify those people who are not on the road to dementia, those people who are, and in the latter case, we get them into programs as early as possible. And even if the drugs don't work, we don't have drugs, but there are lifestyle changes that people can make that will certainly slow things down or increase their chances of remaining or maintaining their normal activities of daily living for as long as possible. And we've talked about some of them, good sleeping habits, regular exercise, making smart choices about things like smoking and drinking. Obesity is a big risk factor for dementia, and of course that's something that some people are able to work on. So yeah, I mean, so that was the first thing is prediction, being able to predict as early as possible, and prevention, I guess, goes sort of hand in hand with that. That the earlier we can predict, the better we can take steps to try and prevent.
Yeah, it would seem too, without the capacity to somewhat adequately predict the risk of dementia, it's a little hard to assess some of the prevention behavioral changes that we might be able to do. And if we, because somebody could say, well, if you take this particular supplement, you're not going to get dementia. Well, yeah, you might do that in 100 people and 50 of them get dementia and 50 don't. And you say, oh, look, we prevented dementia in 50 people. How do we know that? You may have caused the dementia in the other 50%. And so being able to understand how the behavior and the treatments are all working together to either increase our risk or decrease our risk really depends on our ability to be able to predict the risk in the first place.
It does. And this is where so-called big data becomes really important. I mean, scientifically, we live in very exciting times where it's possible to get access to databases of tens of thousands, sometimes millions of individuals. And then it becomes possible to look back and say, well, what did this person look like 5 years ago? What was their functioning like? And use that to sort of predict forwards. And I think this is some of these techniques that have been developed using things like machine learning, which most people will have heard of by now, to try and pull out really complex patterns in the data. We had a big paper last year where we decided to look at all the lifestyle factors we could think of, and this is just things that you make a choice about, not things that you can't make a choice about, like your age, but things like whether you drink, smoke, exercise, sleep for more than 8 hours a day. We had, I think, 27 different factors that we had identified as being potential things that people think can affect their cognitive function. And we were absolutely determined to find the magic formula, the sort of design for life. And we used a very complex form of machine learning and many, many thousands of data from many, many thousands of individuals who'd all taken the Creyos tests and given us all this information about themselves. And we were quite sure that we were going to come up with a magic formula, which was, you should drink 1 glass of red wine a day, never, exercise for 1 hour a day, do this, do that, and the answer is no, there is no magic formula. There was nothing buried in the data that if you did this combination of things, you would optimize your cognitive function. Now, there are a few things that did bubble to the top, and some of them are quite surprising. Video gaming, for example, kept coming up time and time again. People that play a lot of video games were doing better at their cognitive tests. But and obviously there were things that are very clearly bad for you, like complete lack of any exercise. But beyond that, there was no magic formula, despite the fact that we threw our best statisticians at the problem. It was quite disappointing, to be honest.
Is it disappointing, or is it just the reality of human variability? I mean, we have genetics that is going to be a factor, activity, lack of activity, whether we have that glass of wine, 2 glasses of wine, it's a mess.
You're right. You're right. I'm just this week finishing a book about executive function. Things like working memory and planning and problem solving and reasoning. It's a sort of it's not a science book. It's a popular science book. And my editor sort of said, at the end, well, then we need a sort of a take home for why some people are better at this than other people. And I gave exactly the answer you just did. And this is what I've written at the end of the book, that at the end of the day, life is so complex. Do I remember whether I've ever been concussed? I think, I played rugby as a kid. I probably was knocked out, but we didn't call it a concussion in those days. Yeah, my brother whacked me on the head with a pillow at some point. I fell down the stairs. That probably had a little effect over here. I don't know how many glasses of wine I've drunk during my life, and whether they've had any effect on my brain. As you said earlier, everybody is different, and you can't possibly accommodate every possible thing that's occurred in their lifetime that could have contributed to their current brain function. And we tend to focus on the really obvious things. We say, well, okay, let's look at football players. They all have big, many bangs to their heads, and yep, many of them go on to develop dementia. There's a link there. But for the rest of us that don't play football and don't do things that are really obviously bad for your brain, the number of things that would have affected our brain function over the course of our lives is unimaginably huge, and it's very, very hard to get to the bottom of the relationship between all of those different factors and cognitive function.
Yeah, so we just got to take the science with a little bit of a grain of salt and try things, what works for us. If it's improving our cognitive ability or helping us maintain it, then it's probably good for us. Maybe that glass of wine a day helps somebody prevent dementia, but for another person, because of their genetics, epigenetics, it might cause them to have earlier onset of dementia.
Agreed. Yeah.
There's just so much complexity. And that's one thing we come across on this podcast all the time. It's like, we're not going to give you these bullet points of do these 5 exercises or do these 5 different brain activities. It might work for some, it might work for others.
Completely agree with you. I mean, my message, if I can say one thing, would be, try to maintain your brain. Your brain is really precious. It is the only organ in your body that is basically you. We live in a world where we can replace people's hearts, we can replace lungs, we can replace livers, kidneys. You can't replace your brain. Once your brain is damaged, it's damaged, and there's not another one on the shelf they can slot in and give you a new brain. So there are, everything we've said, I agree with, but at the end of the day, try to avoid, getting bangs on the head, try to avoid getting involved in activities that involve head injuries, rattling your brain around inside your skull, and do the best to maintain your brain, because though we do know that not maintaining your brain is not good for you in the long term.
And so what would you, if I said, okay, give me a list of 5 or 6 things that you said, this is your top recommendations for helping the brain to age well. What would those be?
I think one of the factors we haven't talked about at all is socialization. I mean, something that is absolutely, there's no question about this. The science in both human studies and in other animals have shown that if you maintain your social life into old age, it has some sort of preventative effects. Now, exactly what the mechanism for that is, I don't know. But stay social, stay talking to people, do things, keep doing things. Whether it's Sudoku or crosswords or video games, or keep your mind active. Because again, there's no question that staying mentally active is helpful for maintaining cognition, into old age. And the other is, avoid as best you can things that will directly impact your brain function, involving yourself in activities that will likely result in either minor or major, brain damage. But I think socialization and my key would be, yeah, stay social and stay mentally active.
That was almost an open door to kind of bring in that social activity piece, because you've kind of touched on, we talk as 6 pillars on this podcast, and those are regular exercise, physical activity, maintaining a healthy body composition, and you brought up obesity there. Eating a healthy diet. So the foods that we eat are going to have some impact on, how big, we don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of argument back and forth between the ketogenic diet for brain health versus eating a healthier plant-based diet. You mentioned smoking. I kind of link alcohol within the diet piece. Sleep, we've talked about sleep. That's kind of to get all 4 of the early ones. It's like our 5th pillar. And then social, purposeful social connections being a really, really big one. And
Yeah.
And that leads me to my next question we ask all of our guests. What are you doing personally to age well, whether it's brain health or just aging well in general?
I'm 59. I don't think I'm doing very well at it, to be honest. I'm still just sort of south of the the risk decade for dementia, I suppose. I mean, I personally remain, I think, very active mentally. I mean, partly it's because that's my job. I'm a professor of neuroscience, so I run a large lab. I interact with my students every day. We're designing new studies, thinking about new ways of tackling brain function. So in some senses, I'm lucky that my job keeps me very mentally active. But in my downtime, I play music. I play in a band, so I have bandmates that I meet every week, and we jam, and we try and we connect. In that way. I do a lot of. I have a lot of hobbies, mostly related to sort of music and other sort of creative things like video editing and these sorts of things that are nothing to do with my work at all. They're just things I've always been interested in. So I think if I stop doing all of those things, I really feel like my brain function would suffer, because I feel like I constantly need to be solving a problem, whether it's trying to work out how I get the key right in this song I'm trying to learn, or how many participants we need for this next study that we're going to publish, or how I'm going to tell my student that he's not doing very well and he's going to have to put his socks up. And I'm constantly sort of problem solving and sort of involving myself in sort of mental exercises. I think. I mean, more or less from the time I get up to I spend very little time. And as I say, I don't know that I'm the best example, but I feel like I'm maintaining my cognitive health pretty well at 59. But pretty much from the moment I get up to the moment I sleep, I don't ever sit around doing nothing, really. I'm always thinking about something.
What about physically? That's the challenge sometimes for us, I think, as academics. We're so busy using the brain, the mind, and the social connections, but maybe not having enough time to exercise and getting active. Are you still playing rugby?
No, I haven't played rugby since I was about 14. And I probably wouldn't do it now, actually. And I have an 11-year-old son. I probably wouldn't let him play rugby either, because I think well, it's partly that, I really want to look after his brain, but also I don't want to be, the neuroscientist whose son had a head injury playing rugby when I didn't shut it down early on. So luckily he shows no interest in rugby or in hockey, which of course another big sport that can often lead to concussion. So no, I'm not an angel at all. And where physical exercise is concerned, I'm far from it. I definitely don't get enough exercise. I do try to cycle to work whenever I can. and we have a dog, and occasionally I walk the dog, but I don't go to the gym, and I definitely don't do enough exercise. And as you said, I kind of feel like I should, but it's just hard to find the time. That's not an excuse. I'm going to have to find the time because, if my brain doesn't kill me, my body possibly will if I don't actually start to do more exercise. So, um, don't, don't, don't use me as a model of exercise, folks. I think you're more the guy that they should be looking to for physical exercise, Jeff.
Well, you are biking to work and walking the dog and doing some of that. So you're getting some level of physical activity, which is probably more than about half of at least the US population. I'm not sure. I've never heard the Canadian statistics on physical activity, but you're probably doing better than most.
Okay. Better than most, but not good enough, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess it's like I think what I try to do to at least sort of tick that physical box is to do things that I enjoy doing. So I actually really like cycling. I really hate, we have a treadmill downstairs. I hate running on a treadmill. I really, really detest it. So I don't do it. But and this I think is something that people can do. Try and turn it into something you enjoy doing. And again, with mental exercise, it's the same thing. Don't if you don't want to learn a foreign language, don't learn a foreign language. Go and play the trumpet, or in order to keep yourself mentally active, do something that is going to be rewarding and enjoyable for you, because it makes it much easier to do and much more likely that it will be effective.
Yeah, it's interesting because I give the same response to, I tell my students the same response when they're talking about, well, what's the best cardiovascular exercise? Well, what do you like to do? What are you going to do regularly? So same thing as cognitive exercise. If do you like doing Sudoku? Then that's going to be good for you. If you don't, try something else, but do something that you're going to be doing regularly.
Agreed. And there are so many possibilities, right? Just as there are with physical exercise, there's so many things that you do to maintain your sort of mental activity.
So we have not talked much about your book, Into the Gray Zone. Tell us a little bit about the book. What do you expect the viewer, the listener, the reader of the book to take home from reading the book?
Oh, that's interesting because it touches on something that I already said. So the book is, yes, Into the Grey Zone, Neuroscientist Explores the Border Between Life and Death. So something we've not really talked about. A lot of the work that I do is on very serious brain injury. People who have either had a traumatic brain injury or a stroke or some other event that has seriously affected their brain, and they've ended up in a coma or in a vegetative state. So these are not people who are mildly concussed. These are people who really have had a very serious brain injury. And what I do a lot of the time is to develop neuroimaging methods for trying to improve prognosis. That is, can we predict who's going to recover and who's likely to not recover? And also improve diagnosis, because it turns out a lot of these patients aren't in the situation we think they are. Just because a patient is not responding doesn't necessarily mean that they're not aware, for example. And the book, Into the Grey Zone, again, it's a popular science book, so anybody can read it. It sort of weaves together several different stories. One is the story of how we managed to show, and this happened in 2006, that some patients who are supposedly in a vegetative state are actually completely aware. They're aware of who they are, where they are, and the situation that they're in, despite the fact that even very experienced professionals, sometimes for decades, have assumed that they have no awareness at all. They don't know who they are and where they are. So it's a story of how we discovered that, and that was really almost a 20-year series of scientific investigations, working with different patients, and we gradually pulled the pieces apart and worked out how we could use brain imaging to show that some patients are aware. And we actually went on to communicate with several patients to get them to be able to talk to us, if you like, just by changing their patterns of activity in their brain. And I sort of interweave that with things that were going on in my life at the time. Different things were happening in my life that pushed me in certain directions and made me think things. And the point of doing that was, I think, to make the book a bit more accessible to non-scientists, but also to show that science is just another activity that some of us choose to do, and it intersects in many different ways with our own lives. Probably the reason that I got into brain imaging was I was very ill as a child. I had Hodgkin's disease, a cancer of the lymph system. So I spent many of my teenage years inside brain scanners at various points, or body scanners. And that definitely produced a fascination with imaging, and the fact that we can look inside the body or look inside the brain without, having to get a scalpel out. And there are, many events I can look back in my life that sort of influenced the decisions I made to become a neuroscientist and to get into looking at things like, dementia and so, that's what the book's about. It's a story. It's a story of and there's also a lot of great patient stories in there. I've met some fantastic patients over the years. People who have coped with enormous challenges, both the patients and their family members, that have overcome incredible challenges, sometimes bouncing back. There's a lovely story in the book of a patient called Juan, who has at the age of 19 has a really serious brain injury, and we got him up here to London. We scanned him, couldn't find anything going on in his brain, and a few months later he recovered. He came out of his vegetative state. He taught himself to walk again. He taught himself to go back to college, and it's a great story because I see him on both sides of this journey. At the beginning of the chapter, he's lying in front of me, almost corpse-like, I suppose, completely unresponsive. And by the end of the chapter, he's back at college doing his studies again, and he reports on the experience of being aware, but nobody thinking he was aware. It's incredible. He talks about how it felt to be lying there in our brain scanner with everybody around him thinking that he was in a vegetative state. Yeah, he was completely aware. He remembered everything. He knew who he was, where he was, and what was going on. But he had no way of communicating this to the outside world because he was literally locked inside his brain. So the overarching message of the book, I mean, there's lots of things like that. The overarching message is something that I said earlier, which is that we are our brains. That is who we are. We're not something else. At the end of the day, we are our brains. You take somebody's brain out, they no longer exist. But you take their lungs out and they still exist, and they still have the same personality and the same thoughts and the same memories and the same everything else. But at the end of the day, you are that box inside your head. That's the real you, and that's why it's so important to protect it.
So where can our listeners learn a bit more about your work? And more importantly, where can they access the book, Into the Gray Zone?
The book you can find everywhere. You get it on Amazon or any good bookstore will still ship the book. It came out in 2017, but it's still available. That's really what I would say. And if you go to intothegrayzone.com, there's a lot more information, both about the book with some videos of the patients. The patients gave me permission to identify them and show videos of them. So intothegrayzone.com has videos of patients, videos of us scanning patients. There's even a BBC documentary that was made in 2012 of the first time that we managed to communicate with a patient who had supposedly been in a vegetative state for 12 years. And that's a pretty incredible video because, for the first time, he's suddenly able to communicate with us and with his family. But you get the book in any good bookstore or any online resource.
Right. Is there anything we missed talking about today? I know there's some topics that I would love to kind of dive into a bit deeper with you that maybe weren't necessarily related to dementia or whatnot, because I know consciousness would be an interesting topic I'd like to tackle with you. And maybe we can
do it again, Jeff.
Yes, we will absolutely have you back.
We hardly touched on consciousness. Yeah, most of the work that I do, even the work with dementia, is actually related around, is sort of built around consciousness, to be honest. I mean, my fascination with dementia, there's a sort of a practical fascination, which is, can we predict who's going to dement? And that's a problem that needs to be solved. And I'm keen to continue to be involved in that. But actually, my fascination with the condition itself is more about consciousness, which is that I like to think of dementia as being a so-called disorder of consciousness. And that is, what I mean by that is, when a demented patient meets their spouse, for example, it's not just that they've forgotten who they are. It's not just a memory impairment. They're not going to get the same emotional reaction that many of us would get when we meet our spouse. They're not going to remember the fact that, last year we went on vacation to Hawaii. They're not going to, realize that there's somebody here who, really cares about them and loves them. There's a whole package. Their entire conscious experience of interacting, for example, with their spouse is different. It's not just that they don't remember who their spouse is. As a function of that, their entire conscious experience changes. And I'm sort of fascinated with that idea that there's sort of the motif of my lab is, what is it like to? And, that's, what is it like to have Alzheimer's disease? What is it like to have a general anesthetic? What is it like to be asleep? What is it like to, all the questions we ask really are, what is that state actually like relative to the normal, typical, waking, healthy state that most of us are able to experience?
Well, we will definitely plan on having you back to dive into that a little bit deeper. So we'll talk a bit more on that. Anything else you need to add as we kind of wrap up for today?
No, don't think so. Thanks so much. Questions were great.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed this conversation. I feel like I've learned, as I always do on every interview that I do on this podcast, I learn more. It helps me to grow. Hopefully my brain is a little bit healthier now as a matter of this. But just kind of keep doing what you're doing and keep aging well. Maybe exercise a little bit more. But
I think so. Thanks.
Well,
I think you're right, but I will. Yeah, thanks very much, Jeff. That was great fun.
Thank you for listening. I hope you benefited from today's podcast. And until next time, keep aging well.